In this tutorial, I'm going to cover how to reduce landscape texture tiling when you create a landscape material. One of the most common problems when you create a landscape material is to have your texture tile very noticeably across your terrain. It often looks very good up close, near the player, but at further distances, it's tiled very noticeably. So in this video, I'm gonna show you how to reduce this texture tiling with macro texture variation technique. And this technique is actually used in a lot of the starter content. And you can use it for a lot of different things in order to reduce the tiling. But in this video, I'm gonna specifically focus on landscapes. Here I have a map open and it does not have any materials applied to it. So I'm going to create a new material and that's where we're going to start from. I'm just going to select one of these folders that I already have and then go inside the materials folder and create a new material. I'm going to name it M_LNDS for landscape macro variation. And you can name it anything you want. And I'm going to right click on the material and create a material instance right away. Because when you work with landscapes, you really want to have a material instance applied to your landscape instead of the material itself. The material instance will allow you to change the properties or certain parameters in real time rather than having to wait for compiling shaders. And that's what we're going to apply to the landscape. And once I created the material instance, it assigns a postfix of INST. So I'm going to just keep the same name. Then I'm going to left click on the landscape to select it and go into the details panel. I'm going to scroll down until I see a landscape material property. And I'm going to use the drop down menu and search for macro variation. And then assign the material instance to the landscape. The landscape will turn black, and this is normal because we haven't done anything to the material. Then I'm going to jump back over to Content Browser and double click on the material we just created, the macro variation. So it opens up the material editor. And now we're going to begin creating our setup. So the first thing I want to do is have just a texture that we're going to use for the landscape. So for this, I'm going to need to jump back over to Content Browser. And I'm actually going to open up a new panel so you can see better. And inside Starter Content, Textures, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to use this T ground grass texture. So I'm going to left click, hold and drag and drop it right into the material editor. And to get things started, I'm just going to go ahead and connect the RGB into base color. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. Now, because we are creating a material for a landscape, you would want to have a layer blend node so you have something to paint with on top of your landscape. But the layer blend node is not always necessary. And in that case, we're not going to use it. This way we can just focus on the technique itself without having to paint layers and create layer infos. So I'm going to hit apply and let's take a look. And you can see the noticeable tiling that it creates. And obviously this is not going to work. But this goes to show you that if you use a texture without controlling any scale or doing anything to it, you will have very noticeable repetition of it. And it may work on certain objects that are smaller in size, but on large objects, such as a landscape, it isn't going to work. I'm going to go back into the material editor and I'm going to quickly insert two constant 1 vectors because I want to control metallic and roughness. So I'm going to plug the first one into metallic and keep it at 0. And by default, it's already set to 0, meaning it's non-metallic. So you actually don't have to do this, but I like to have it as a visual reminder. And it only takes a few seconds. And the second constant 1 vector is going to go into roughness. And I'm going to change the default value to 0.85. I'm going to hit apply and quickly show you. Here our landscape is not as shiny as it was before. And it will make it easier to continue forward so we don't see that shiny glare from our grass. The foundation of this macro variation setup is a texture that's going to be multiplied at different scales and then overlaid and combined with our grass texture. And this macro variation texture is found inside Starter Content and Textures folder. If you scroll down, and here it is, T_macro variation. If I double click on it, this is a simple texture that looks like of a concrete wall. And this is what we're going to use. But if you have something similar that you want to use instead, you could. Just make sure it matches the values with not much light and dark variation. And this texture also has to be tileable. So I'm going to go ahead and left click, hold and drag this texture right into the material editor. Then duplicate this texture sample 2 more times. Select it and press Ctrl W, so you have 3 total. We're going to scale each of these textures at different values, small, medium and large, and then we're going to combine it all together. And this what creates our texture variation. So in order to scale them, we need a node called texture coordinate. So I'm going to right click in the empty space and search for texture. And it's this right here, texture coordinate. Left click on it to insert it. Then duplicate the texture coordinate 2 more times, 1 for each texture sample. And to change the texture coordinates, the scale of the texture, we need to multiply it with something. So first, let's go ahead and insert a multiply node. If you hold M and left click, this will insert a multiply. You can also right click, search for multiply, or you can duplicate an existing node. Ctrl W. Then let's begin connecting. For the top texture sample, I'm going to take this texture cord and plug it into multiply A, and then the multiply output into the UV input of the texture sample. And then do the same thing for the second and the third setup. And then for each multiply, we can change the constant B value to adjust the texture scale. And this is the value that it's being multiplied with. And smaller the number, the larger the texture scale. And we want to go below 1 into the fractions between 0 and 1. So for the first one, we're going to change it to 0.2. So select the first multiply and change the constant B value to 0.2. And if you want to see what it looks like, select the texture sample, right click on it, and choose Start Preview Node. So if I change the multiply constant B back to 1, it will give us the default scale, and 0.2 will make it a bit larger. Then I'm going to go ahead and start previewing the second texture sample. And for this multiply, I'm going to change it to even lower of 0.05. And then for the third one, we're going to go even lower than that to 0.002. So you could tweak these numbers and find what you're looking for. But right now, just use the same values and then you can adjust them later. Now there is a slightly better way to adjust the number for each multiply. So instead of doing it within the multiply itself, we would use a constant 1 vector and then plug it into multiply B for each one. And then changing the constant 1 vector to a different value, it would do the same thing. And actually I'm going to do this later for the material instance. But right now let's keep it simple and use what we have. So I'm going to delete this constant 1 vector. And next, we need to add all 3 of these texture samples together. You can right click, search for add, and insert it that way. You can hold down A and left click to insert the add. Or you can of course duplicate it by selecting the add and pressing Ctrl W. Now we need to connect each texture sample to add. Now it's very important that you do not use RGB, but instead you want to use one of the individual channels, R, G, or B. So if I go ahead and open up the macro variation texture, we're going to use the red channel. So going back to our texture sample, I'm going to grab the red channel, left click, hold and drag, and connect it into add A. And we will not connect anything into add B. It will maintain a value which is currently set to 1. Then I'm going to go ahead and connect the second texture sample, red channel, into add A, and do the same thing for the third texture sample. And now we need to multiply all of these add nodes together. So I'm going to hold down M and left click to insert 2 multiply nodes. One up here and the second one right below it. Then I'm going to take the second add and connect it into the bottom multiply A, and take the third add and connect it into the bottom multiply B. And then for the first add at the very top, I'm going to connect it into the top multiply A. And then take this bottom multiply and connect it into the multiply B. So this is how you want to connect all your adds together. And now we just need to combine it with our grass texture sample. I'm going to move this texture sample closer. And we need a multiply node. And that's how we're going to combine it together. So I'm going to insert a multiply. Then take the texture sample, RGB, connect it into multiply B. And then the multiply from the macro texture variation and connect it into multiply A. And then we just need to take this multiply output and connect it into the base color of the material. Now let's hit apply and take a look. The texture will be very bright and overexposed. And to fix that, we need to bring down our constant B values for every add node to 0.5. So let's go back into the material editor. I'm going to marquee select all three add nodes and change the constant B to 0.5. Make sure you do this to all three add nodes, and changing it to 0.5 will fix that. Let's hit apply and test. Here we go, and it looks pretty good. Our macro variation is working. We have enough variety here that it's hard to tell that it's one single texture. But this light to dark variation, these splotches, that is created by the macro variation, might be too much, and you might want to turn down the contrast. So these variations are not as strong. So let me show you how to do that now. I'm going to disconnect our texture sample and the multiply by holding down Alt and left clicking to break the connection. And we're going to set up a contrast control. And first we're going to insert a constant 3 vector. Right click on empty space, search for constant, and we need this constant 3 vector. Left click on it to insert it. Then we need a linear interpolate. So again, right click, search for linear, and insert this linear interpolate. Connect the constant 3 vector into lerp A. Lerp B input will be empty, and it will be controlled by the constant B value within the lerp itself, which is set to 1. And then we're going to take the multiply output from the macro texture variation and connect it into alpha of the lerp. And then select the constant 3 vector, and we need to change these values to 0.5 for R, G, and B. This will give us a medium gray value, and it will reduce the contrast. And then we just need to take the lerp output and combine it with our grass texture sample by plugging it into multiply A. And then we still have the texture sample plugged into multiply B, and then this multiply is then plugged in into the base color of the material. Alright, everything looks good. Let's go ahead, apply, and take a look. Here we are. Looks much better. We have reduced our contrast of these splotches, and they're not as noticeable. At this point, we are done with our texture variation. It is working, but everything we've done is inside the material itself. And if I go ahead, open up our material instance, we have no controls to adjust any of the scaling or tiling for our macro variations, and we have no way to adjust our contrast. So we are stuck with what we have, and if we want to change it, we have to go back into the material. So now I'm going to show you how to set up a few properties, a few parameters that will expose them inside the material instance. And then you'll be able to change these parameters within the material instance, and it will give you more control over your material. So I'm going to go back into the material editor, and first I'm going to comment out the contrast controls. I'm going to marquee select the constant 3 vector and the lerp, press C to create a comment box, and name it reduce macro contrast. And then our first parameter is going to be this constant 3 vector, this contrast control. I'm going to select the constant 3 vector, right click, and convert to a parameter. And I'm going to name this parameter macro contrast. Our default values will be 0.5 across R, G, and B. Alright, this one is done. Our next 3 parameters are going to control the tiling of each macro texture. So we have 3 set up, one for small tiling, one for medium tiling, and one for large tiling. And right now we're all changing the tiling within the multiply node. But instead, we need to have a constant one vector converted to a parameter and then plugged into multiply b. And this is what is going to give us the exposed parameter inside the material instance. So let's come up to the first one at the top. If you hold down 1 on the keyboard and left click, this will insert a constant one vector. And I'm going to insert 1 for each. So we have 3 total. Then I'm going to select the top one, right click, and convert to a parameter. With it selected, I'm going to rename it, and this one will be small macro. Then I'm going to convert the second one to a parameter and name this medium macro. And then convert the third one to a parameter and name it large macro. And then we need to set a default value for each. I'm going to select the small macro, and the default value for this is going to be the same as we used for multiply, 0.2. Medium macro, default value for this will be 0.05. And then for large macro, 0.002. Now once we plug in each constant one vector or each parameter into multiply b, it will override whatever value we were using before within the multiply itself. So to avoid any confusion, I'm going to go ahead and reset each multiply to the default values. So I'm going to select them and then reset to default the constant b input. So we're back to 1 for each. Then connect each parameter into the appropriate multiply b input. I'm going to marquee select this entire setup and comment it out. Press C. And I'm going to name this comment box macro texture variation. And that's it. As far as our parameters go for macro variation and for our contrast, we are done. But before we leave, I do want to set up a way to control the tiling of our landscape texture. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to insert a landscape coords node. Right click on the empty space, search for landscape, and we need this node right here, landscape layer coords. And we could just take this node and plug it directly into the UV input of the texture sample. And then change the map and scale within the landscape coords. But of course, we want to be able to do this within the material instance instead. So let's set this up. I'm going to insert a constant one vector and then convert it to a parameter. And I'm going to name it grass tiling and give it a default value of 1. And then we need to combine these two together so we can use it. So in my case, whenever I use a landscape coords with a parameter, instead of using multiply, I use a divide node. Divide allows me to use whole values to control the tiling. So I can use 1, 2, 3, and so on. And if I were to use multiply, I would need to use fractions between 0 and 1 to do the same thing. So it just makes it easier and more intuitive to enter whole values to change the tiling so it can work how you would expect it. Now multiply will also work, and it's up to you whichever one you want to use. So I tend to use divide whenever I use the landscape coords node. So I'm going to go ahead and search for divide and insert it. And then I'm going to take the landscape coords, plug it into divide A, and that grass tiling parameter into divide B, and then the divide output into the texture sample UVs. Alright, that's it. Let's hit apply and see what we have. I'm going to bring back our material instance editor, and first I'm going to enable the 3 macro controls. And we can begin to change them and adjust our small, medium, and large macro variation. Then let's enable our macro contrast. If I change the RGB to 0, this will give us full intensity. And if I change it to 1, this will essentially remove the macro contrast. And the key to this is you have to keep it within the grayscale value. And then I'm going to enable grass tiling and increase it. When this number goes up, we actually are decreasing the tiling and making it larger. So this will help to reduce some of that texture tiling even more. So this macro texture variation technique is a great technique to use. And you could use it by itself as is, but you can combine it with other techniques. And one of them is distance tiling. And what distance tiling does is it allows you to have a texture at a different scale near the player, and then at a certain distance further away, which you get to define, it switches to different texture tiling. So you have one texture scale near the player within a certain radius, and then it will naturally switch over to larger texture scale at further distances. And if you combine the macro variation technique and the distance tiling technique, this will completely remove any texture repetition you have on your landscape. And I show you how to set up distance tiling in UE4 Fundamentals Volume 2 Landscape Essentials tutorial course. So if you want to learn how to do that technique, as well as how to create landscape materials, how to set up paint layers, how to paint textures in your landscape, and how to make your materials look good in your landscape, as well as how to sculpt your landscapes entirely inside UE4, then take a look at the UE4 Fundamentals Volume 2 Landscape Essentials course. You can download this course at worldofleveldesign.com/store. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next tutorial.